On a tense November day in 1799, a thin general in a plain coat walked into the chamber of the French legislature, surrounded by soldiers, and tried to overthrow the government of his own country. It nearly went wrong. Deputies shouted him down, hands grabbed at him, and for a moment the great Napoleon stood pale and stammering, almost undone. Then the bayonets came in, the hall was cleared, and by the end of that long day the French Republic had a new master. He was 30 years old. He had no royal blood, no fortune, nothing but a uniform and a reputation. Within 5 years he would place a crown on his own head inside the Cathedral of Notre-Dame, and within 6 he would stand as the undisputed master of the European continent. This is the story of how a soldier of the revolution made himself an emperor. Welcome back to History with Rohrman. This is episode 3 of our series, Napoleon: Rise and Fall. In the last episode, we followed him through the dazzling campaign in Italy and the stranger gamble in Egypt, and we left him sailing quietly home, abandoning a trapped army to return to a France that was frightened, badly governed, and desperate for a strong hand. Today, he seizes that opportunity with both hands. We will watch him take power, secure it with one of the luckiest victories of his career, reform the country from top to bottom, and then crown himself. And we will watch him build the most brilliant run of military triumphs in modern history, even as one disaster at sea quietly seals the limit of everything he can ever achieve. Let us begin. First, the situation he came home to. France in 1799 was exhausted. 10 years of revolution had left it governed by a 5-man committee called the Directory, a regime that almost nobody loved and almost everybody distrusted. It was seen as corrupt, weak, and unstable, lurching from crisis to crisis. And abroad, the Second Coalition, that fresh alliance of Austria, Russia, Britain, and others, had gone on the attack while Napoleon was stuck in the east. Much of his hard-won conquest in Italy had been rolled back. To many people across the political spectrum, the Republic seemed to be failing, and they were quietly looking for someone, anyone, who could give it order and strength. Into that vacuum stepped a war hero whose recent failures in Egypt were not yet widely known. The plot to overthrow the Directory was not really Napoleon's idea. It was hatched by clever, ambitious politicians who wanted a general to provide the muscle and the popularity, while they supplied the brains. They imagined Napoleon as the sword in their hand. He had other plans. The coup unfolded on the 9th and 10th of November, 1799, dates known on the revolutionary calendar as the 18th and 19th of Brumaire. The first day went smoothly enough. The second day, the day in the legislative chamber, very nearly collapsed in chaos, saved only when soldiers marched in and drove the deputies out at bayonet point. It was messy, improvised, and far from glorious. But it worked. The Directory was swept away, and a new government called the Consulate took its place, with 3 consuls at its head. And there was never any real doubt about who the First Consul would be. Napoleon held the real power now, and he had no intention of sharing it. But power seized is not the same as power secured, and his position was dangerously fragile. He had taken charge of a country still at war and still losing ground in Italy. If he wanted to be more than a passing strongman, he needed to prove himself all over again on a battlefield against the great powers. So in the spring of 1800, the First Consul did something audacious. He gathered a new army in secret and led it across the Alps to fall upon the Austrians in Italy from an unexpected direction. In May of 1800, his troops hauled themselves and their guns over the high, snow-choked passes of the Great St. Bernard, dragging cannon through the ice on sledges and hollowed-out logs. It was the image later painted again and again, the leader on a rearing horse, pointing over the mountains, though in truth he crossed on a sure-footed mule, led by a local guide. The point stands. He had appeared in Italy where no one expected him, behind the Austrian army. The gamble almost ended in catastrophe. On the 14th of June, 1800, the 2 armies collided on the plain of Marengo. Napoleon, overconfident, had spread his forces too thin, and the Austrians hit him hard and drove his army back for hours. By the afternoon, it looked like a French defeat, and word was already spreading that the great Bonaparte had finally been beaten. Then, late in the day, a detached French corps under a general named Desaix came marching back toward the sound of the guns, arriving just in time. A fresh assault and a well-timed cavalry charge turned the rout into a stunning victory. Desaix himself was killed in the moment of triumph. Marengo was a battle Napoleon nearly lost through his own mistakes, but he won it, and that was what mattered. The victory secured his hold on Italy, and far more importantly, it secured his hold on France. A first consul who wins is a first consul nobody dares to remove. With another French army victorious in Germany, Austria had had enough. The Treaty of Luneville in early 1801 confirmed French dominance across Italy and the German borderlands and knocked Austria out of the war. The next year, even Britain, tired and isolated, agreed to a truce in the Peace of Amiens. For the first time in a decade, the guns across Europe fell silent. The Second Coalition was finished. And Napoleon, the man who had delivered this peace, was now free to turn to the work that may matter even more than his battles, the rebuilding of France itself. Because here is something easy to forget beneath all the cannon smoke. Napoleon was not only a general. He was one of the most formidable administrators who ever lived, and the years of peace after 1800 were when he reshaped France from the ground up. He made peace with the Catholic Church, healing a bitter wound left by the Revolution, through an agreement with the Pope called the Concordat. He founded a national bank, overhauled the tax system, and built a centralized administration so effective that its basic shape still governs France today. He created schools and a system of honors and promotion based, at least in theory, on talent rather than birth. To a generation born into revolution and chaos, he offered something intoxicating: order, stability, and a career open to anyone with ability. The crown jewel of all this came on the 21st of March, 1804, with the promulgation of a new civil law code, soon known as the Napoleonic Code. It swept away the tangled mess of old feudal laws and replaced them with a single, clear, rational system: equality before the law, the protection of property, secular authority over the state. It was not perfect, and it rolled back some rights, especially for women. But it was a monumental achievement, and it spread far beyond France, carried across Europe on the points of French bayonets. Napoleon himself believed it would outlast all his victories, and in a sense he was right. Long after the battles were lost and forgotten, the code endured. It is still the foundation of law in much of the world today. Now, a man with this much power tends to want to keep it and to pass it on. Napoleon had already made himself consul for life. But there was a problem. As long as he was merely a republican magistrate, he could be assassinated or overthrown, and France would plunge back into chaos. Royalists plotted to kill him. In response, he reached for a startling solution. If France had a hereditary ruler, a dynasty, then killing one man would change nothing, and the stability he had built would be permanent. The logic led in only one direction. On the 18th of May, 1804, the Senate proclaimed Napoleon Bonaparte Emperor of the French. The soldier of the Revolution, the republic that had executed its king barely 11 years before, now had a monarch once again. And then came the moment that captured the whole. Astonishing transformation. On the 2nd of December, 1804, in the great cathedral of Notre-Dame in Paris, Napoleon was crowned emperor. He had summoned the Pope himself from Rome to lend the ceremony the weight of God. But at the decisive instant, Napoleon took the crown and placed it on his own head, and then crowned his wife Josephine as empress with his own hands. The message was unmistakable. He owed his throne to no one, not to the Pope, not to God, not to any old royal line. He had taken it himself by his own will and his own achievements. A poor outsider from Corsica had made himself the equal of the ancient crowned houses of Europe. They would not forgive it, for across the continent, the kings and emperors watched this coronation with horror. To them, Napoleon was not a legitimate sovereign. He was an upstart, a usurper, the armed embodiment of the revolution they all feared, now wearing a crown and claiming a seat at their table. Britain had already grown alarmed, and the fragile peace of Amiens had collapsed back into war. Now, in 1805, Britain pulled together a third coalition, drawing in Austria eager for revenge and Russia, ruled by the young and idealistic Tsar Alexander I. Once again, a ring of monarchies closed around France. And this is where our central theme snaps into focus, the deadlock that will define everything to come, the supreme power of the land against the untouchable power of the sea. Look first at the sea. Through 1803 and 1804, Napoleon had massed a great army on the cliffs at Boulogne, on the French coast, staring across the narrow channel at England. His plan was direct: invade Britain, land his soldiers on English soil, and finish the war that had defied him for so long. There was only one obstacle, but it was absolute: the Royal Navy. To carry an army across the Channel, even for a single day, France needed control of those waters, and the British fleet would never allow it. Everything depended on luck, timing, and somehow drawing the British ships away. It did not work. On the 21st of October, 1805, off the coast of Spain near Cape Trafalgar, the combined French and Spanish fleet met the British Navy under Admiral Horatio Nelson, the same Nelson who had trapped Napoleon in Egypt 7 years before. What followed was one of the most decisive naval battles in all of history. Nelson drove his ships straight into the enemy line in 2 columns, breaking it apart and destroying it piece by piece. By the end of the day, the French and Spanish fleets were shattered, while not a single British ship was lost. Nelson himself was struck down by a sniper in the hour of victory and died aboard his flagship, dying a legend. Trafalgar settled the question of the sea for a generation. Britain now ruled the oceans absolutely, and Napoleon's dream of invading England was dead forever. Whatever he did next, the sea would never be his. But while the fleets were fighting at Trafalgar, Napoleon had already turned his back on the Channel. The Austrians and Russians were marching, and so the great army at Boulogne wheeled around and swept east across Europe in a lightning march toward the Danube, toward the heart of the continent. And here, on land, we see Napoleon at the very summit of his genius. In October of 1805, he surrounded an entire Austrian army at the city of Ulm and forced it to surrender almost without a fight, tens of thousands of men captured by maneuver alone. He marched on and occupied Vienna itself. But the real masterpiece was still to come. On the 2nd of December, 1805, the first anniversary of his coronation, near a village called Austerlitz, Napoleon fought what many consider the greatest battle of his life. Facing the combined armies of Austria and Russia, with 2 emperors in the field against him, he deliberately weakened his own right flank as bait, inviting the enemy to attack it. They took the bait, shifting their forces to crush that flank and stripping the high ground in their center. At the perfect moment, Napoleon launched his hidden reserves straight up, through the mist into that center, split the Allied army in 2, and rolled it up. It was a catastrophe for the coalition. The Battle of the Three Emperors, as it was called, was a total, crushing French triumph. Austria was knocked out of the war within weeks by the Treaty of Pressburg, and the Third Coalition collapsed in ruins. At Austerlitz, Napoleon reached a height of military mastery that few commanders in history have ever touched. The consequences reshaped the map of Europe. With Austria humbled, Napoleon reorganized the patchwork of German states to suit himself, gathering many of them into a French-controlled bloc called the Confederation of the Rhine. And on the 6th of August, 1806, an institution that had endured for 1,000 years simply ceased to exist. The Holy Roman Empire, the ancient framework of the German lands, was formally dissolved, its last emperor laying down the old imperial crown. A medieval relic was swept away at the stroke of a pen, because Napoleon had made it irrelevant. The old Europe was visibly dying, and he was the one killing it. This was too much for Prussia. Proud of its army and the legacy of Frederick the Great, alarmed by French power on its very doorstep, Prussia went to war almost alone in 1806, forming the core of a fourth coalition. It was a disastrous miscalculation. On the 14th of October 1806, in 2 battles fought on the same day at Jena and Auerstedt, Napoleon and his marshals utterly destroyed the Prussian army. In a single afternoon, the proud military monarchy of Prussia was broken. Napoleon marched into Berlin in triumph, and the Prussian state was left shattered and humiliated, reduced almost overnight from a great power to a French dependency. Only Russia was left fighting. The campaign moved east into the freezing mud and snow of Poland and East Prussia. There, in early 1807, Napoleon met the Russians in the savage, indecisive winter battle of Eylau, fought in a blizzard, a grim bloodbath that ended in no clear victory and shook even his confidence. But in June he caught the Russian army at last at the Battle of Friedland and won the decisive victory he needed. The young Tsar Alexander, his armies beaten and his treasury empty, decided he would rather befriend this extraordinary man than keep fighting him. And so came one of the most remarkable scenes of the age. On the 7th and 9th of July, 1807, the two emperors met to make peace at Tilsit on the river Niemen. Famously, they met on a raft moored in the middle of the river, away from their armies, two rulers dividing the fate of Europe between them. The treaties of Tilsit made Russia a French ally and stripped Prussia of half its territory, reducing it to a husk. Napoleon now dominated almost the entire continent, directly or through allies and family members placed on thrones. From the Atlantic coast to the borders of Russia, Europe answered to one man. At 37 years old, the outsider from Corsica had reached a summit of power that not even the kings of old had ever held. So let us take stock as we always do. In less than 8 years, Napoleon had gone from a desperate gambler in a Paris assembly hall to the master of Europe. He had crowned himself emperor, written a code of law that would outlive every empire, and won at Austerlitz, Jena, and Friedland a string of victories that left his enemies in awe and despair. On land, he was unstoppable, and yet, woven right through this triumph, sits the one thing he could never overcome. Trafalgar, Britain, safe behind its navy, untouched and unconquerable, still at war, still funding every coalition that rose against him. The land was his, the sea would never be, and a power that cannot reach its greatest enemy, no matter how many battles it wins, has a problem it cannot solve by winning more battles. That is the trap that the rest of this story springs. Unable to invade Britain, Napoleon will try to strangle it economically instead, sealing the entire continent against British trade in a vast and ruinous blockade. To enforce it, he will overreach into Spain and open a bleeding wound that never heals. And the same restless ambition that carried him to the raft at Tilsit will eventually point him east, toward the endless plains of Russia and the greatest disaster of his life. The master of Europe has reached the top. In our next episode, we begin to watch him fall. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in episode 4.